My name is Dennis Milam Bensi, and I am the author of Shorn, Toys to Men. I am also a paraphiliac, and I struggle with obsessive-compulsive disorder. Paraphilia is a psychological condition that is often confused with a fetish. A fetish is usually centered around an object, whereas a paraphilia is centered around a behavior. Paraphilias are often exhibitionists, voyeurs, masochism. They involve usually non-consenting adults or children, and there's usually an element of danger involved in the situation. My paraphilia is cutting men's hair, and usually against their will, and that combined with my obsessive-compulsive disorder, I found myself unable to control the urges to cut hair, and things got out of control, and the two situations, the two psychological issues led me down a very dark and unusual path. Most people don't really know the source of their paraphilia, why they have it, where it came from, what causes them to desire the things that they desire. I am able to sort of attribute my paraphilia to a couple of different things. Number one, I was molested when I was 7 years old by a male babysitter. The second thing I can attribute it to is that I was bullied as a child, rather frequently and pretty brutally, and that played a huge part of my self-esteem and affected me deeply. And the other thing I attribute my paraphilia to is I had a distant relationship with my father. He and I didn't have a lot in common, and I was somewhat of a sissy, and he didn't really know how to deal with me, and so he seemed to just distance himself from me. And I think those three things combined is what sort of molded me into the paraphiliac behavior. I think obsessive-compulsive disorder started before my paraphilia. I was a kleptomaniac growing up. I liked to play with dolls, and I couldn't have a doll because I was a boy. My parents wouldn't let me have one, and so I still had this overwhelming urge to play with dolls, so I began shoplifting them. And then when my playtime with dolls, primarily Barbie dolls, was I wanted to style their hair. I wanted to cut and style their hair, and so I would cut and style the doll's hair in secret, and then the doll would have short hair, and then all of a sudden the doll would have no hair, and I would need another doll, so I would just go steal another doll. And this began a cycle of kleptomania and the obsessive-compulsive thing. I got to a point where I was stealing things, and I didn't even realize I was stealing things. I would come home and empty my pockets out, and I would have things in my pocket that weren't even dolls anymore. I was stealing things I didn't even remember stealing at all. By the time I hit puberty, I had already been bullied, and my father and I were not seeing eye to eye, and I had this obsession with cutting hair and cutting dolls' hair, and my father used haircuts as a way of humiliating me. He knew that I didn't want to get a haircut, and so he would use that as a threat of punishment for me. So when I hit puberty, I found myself being attracted to guys, and rather than wanting to necessarily have sex with them, I wanted to humiliate them the way I felt humiliated, by cutting their hair. And I think that is sort of how my paraphilia was born. I found myself sexually kind of messed up. I wanted to humiliate the very people that I was attracted to because I felt humiliated. My paraphilia remained just a fantasy for the longest time. I was stealing and I had the paraphilia, but I wasn't figuring out how to act on things quite yet. And I really got into trouble when I moved to Seattle in 1991. I had been living in a fantasy world, to dull my pain, and all of a sudden I was in Seattle. It's the 90s, the grunge scene was just hitting Seattle. Grunge bands, the long-haired guys, and My Own Private Idaho, the movie, had come out, and so that was sort of glamorizing gay prostitution. And I kind of put together this idea that I could hire gay prostitutes to let me cut their hair to fulfill my paraphilia. And that's what I did. And so I became obsessed, just like I had become obsessed with playing with dolls and cutting dolls' hair. As an adult, I was obsessed with cutting men's hair and was in a supply and demand situation. There wasn't enough hair for me to cut, and I kind of spiraled out of control. By 1998, I had been cutting hair of street hustlers on the streets of Seattle and other cities across the country for over 5 years, and I was beginning to kind of become unhinged. I was losing my grip with reality, and I was also putting myself in a lot of dangerous situations through the gay prostitution rings and stuff like that, and I knew I had to get help or I was going to get murdered or something bad was going to happen to me. So I was able to get myself into therapy and got my first official diagnosis of paraphilia. I'd never heard of the word before I was diagnosed, and obsessive compulsive disorder, and those were two things that were somewhat treatable with medication, so I was able to get on medication and go through some therapy and turn my life around. My book, Shorn Toys to Men, was actually spun out of a therapy exercise. I was given an exercise by my therapist to write a letter to my father and not worry about him ever seeing it, just needing to write the letter and say the things that I needed to say that I'd always been afraid to say. And so I did this exercise, and I actually wrote several letters to my father. There was a lot of things that I never felt I could say, but just writing it down really helped me. I had a whole bunch of things pent up inside of me about hair and him using hair as almost a currency to humiliate me, and once it all came out and I put it on paper, I just kept going and I kept writing, and I wrote more and more until finally I decided I could write a whole book about this subject and kind of help other people who might have the same situation as I do. Just as I was coming out of my therapy and was beginning to write Shorn Toys to Men in earnest, the internet became mainstream, and I got my first computer. I typed into a search engine, haircut. That was one of the first things I did when I got my computer. And I realized that there was this whole sort of underground network of people who had the same sort of paraphilia or even just a mild recreational interest in haircutting as I did. And there were also other people who have other paraphilias and other forms of sexual misfunction that, were sort of hiding underground and were relating to each other on the internet. And it was wonderful to feel like I'm not alone. It was wonderful to feel like there are other people out there who, know what I have gone through. And that was a big part of me writing the book. I wanted to inspire other people to sort of evaluate their life and realize what's good and what's bad and do things to change their life for the better if they need to.